Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief.
The understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission, and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
The continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily, or have been interacting in several different conflicts, and in some cases they're on the same side, and in some cases they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Report in Short.
Welcome back to Report in Short, the bite-sized podcast where we bring you the latest in scholarship from FPRI's Eurasia program. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum. On the docket for today, war as an accelerator. How has Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine impacted a number of domestic governance issues in Russia? Joining us to discuss is the report's author, Andras Toth-Cifra. Let's jump in. This is Report in Short. War as an accelerator. What is your elevator pitch summary here, the key takeaway of your report?
So the key takeaway is that the war changed everything, and thus everything remained the same in Russia. It means that Russia was not prepared for this confrontation with not just Ukraine, but also the global coalition behind Ukraine, not only militarily, but also in terms of domestic governance. I had a previous report for FPRI, which is finished in February 2022, just days before the invasion. And that report looked at some of the deep-seated problems with governance in Russia as Putin approached the end of his presidential term. And in this new report, I look at some of the challenges that were there and that the war has accelerated, hence the title.
Great elevator pitch. I think that provides a good, holistic summary of this very interesting report. Again, we will include a link in the description. Go check it out. Before we talk about more of the report content, you've been a friend of the FPRI podcast for some time now, but tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been focusing on of late.
So I'm a political analyst based in New York City. I am originally from Hungary, but I've lived in the US for a while now. I have a background in Eastern European affairs and more recently data security issues related to the region. Currently, I am also a fellow with FPRI's Eurasia program and a contributor to the Bear Market Brief. And as regards research, I am mostly interested in how illiberal and authoritarian states perform in terms of policy, how they use data, how they are trying to keep and extend their power, and what problems they create for themselves in this process.
Well, if you're interested in Russia, political economy, political risk, listener, stop by the Twitter handle, Bear Market Brief. It is a great resource and hope you can make use of it. All right, let's dive into some of the subject matter here, get a little more in the weeds. So by my read, there are three kind of sections or topics of your report. They are the forced pivot to Asia, centralization and its ills, and last but not least, data leaks and management issues. We'll talk through each now. So tell us a little bit about Russia's pivot to Asia. Why did it come about in the first place? How was it going before the war? And what's happening now?
So first of all, about the topics, just a bit of background. Why these three? I could have chosen any other issues, of course. There are so many issues that came up in Russian governance in the past 3 years. Perhaps the pivot to Asia was one of the most visible ones, but I chose that and the other two because they're connected. So they kind of fit into each other neatly. And I'm trying very, very hard to avoid a nesting doll metaphor here. But these are all pre-existing issues, and I believe that were going to cause problems, including the pivot to Asia to Russia's rulers anyway, or they were at least going to be a central issue. But the war impacted them and exacerbated the problems. And if we start with the very hard and tangible problem of pivot to Asia, again, not a new problem. This predated the 2022 invasion. Russia has been trying to reorient its trade towards Asian markets, most importantly towards China, over the past decade, especially since the 2014 start of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions that came with it, which was mildly successful in that Russia did build, for instance, the Power of Siberia gas pipeline, and there were other grand energy projects in Russia's far east and in Russian north that wanted to reorient Russia's sort of trade infrastructure towards the east. But there were also problems that were not resolved and that have been that had not been considered as urgent as they then became past the February 2022 invasion. And I want to stress this point because it will come back. It comes back all the time that prior to February 2022, Russia's relationship with its traditional export markets, Europe, was not great, but it was perfectly manageable. And therefore, there was no sense of urgency. And even after the February invasion, even in the first months after the invasion, when it was obvious to everyone that it was not going according to plan, there were a lot of people who seem to still trust that things can go back to business as usual, and therefore the sense of urgency that we need to reorient that they need to reorient their export infrastructure to the east and resolve all these problems that suddenly became very urgent came only with a delay of a couple of months, and then they all came crushing down. And one of these problems, for instance, was, which I mentioned in the report, the throughput capacity of Russian railways to the east.
What is throughput capacity for a railway?
It's basically the amount of goods and commodities that they can transport in any given direction. So in Russia's case, for instance, there was a problem with the development projects of the Russian railways, which were planned to be completed much quicker than they actually were, and various commodity producers who used these railways in the Far East, for instance, coal producers, had been complaining about the lack of capacity on the Russian railways before the 2022 invasion. And what the invasion changed is that suddenly there were a lot more various goods and commodities competing for these very finite capacities, and in both directions. And therefore, this created problems because it made the expansion of the railway capacities much more urgent, or if not that, then to find an alternative to it. And it also created problems downstream, down the line, as Russian railways failed to guarantee, for instance, capacity to certain producers or others. Because we're talking about coal, we're talking about timber, we're talking about containers. These goods and commodities that are shipped through these railways have different values, different values added, and therefore it is more efficient to transport some of them and not others. But at the same time, coal producers, for instance, have also a significant political weight.
If I could jump in, yeah. So, but what is the risk of this competition for limited resources because of the war in Ukraine? What does that mean?
This is one of the questions that is really difficult to pin down. I mean, one of the risks is that simply certain goods are not going to get exported, or they're going to get exported, but they need to use workarounds. They need to use, for instance, transportation towards Russia's Arctic coast, for instance, on Siberian rivers, and then they will be transported from there, and that this will ultimately lead to the postponement or the scrapping of various development projects that the companies that use these export routes would otherwise do. It can create conflicts. We have seen how violent some business conflicts have started to become in Russia over the past years. So it can cause a whole lot of problems. It can cause also problems for the regions that rely on these industries and that rely on jobs and tax income from these industries.
Topic number 2, centralization and its ills. What was the problem with centralization?
Well, this is probably the most complex topic of them all. So I will try to be brief here. But Russia has gone through 2 decades of relentless fiscal and political centralization, where one of the latest stages of this was the reforms started under Prime Minister Mishustin, who both tried to increase the federal center's influence over certain appointments in the regions and how, for instance, governors can be dismissed and how certain regional members of the government can be dismissed. Fiscally also, the federal government has increased its sway over regional budgets over the past years. And it also came with a vast data collection exercise whereby the central government tried to collect as much information as possible. And the other side of this was a sort of an outsourcing of the risks, of the political risks to governors. So probably the first major test of this strategy was during COVID, when the governors were tasked to decide what kind of restrictions they are setting up in their own regions. And then this continued when Russia started vaccinating people, which is again a controversial issue. The Kremlin wanted the governors to take the political risks of this. And we see something very similar happening now with military mobilization, with sort of prioritizing the military production, subsidizing local economies, keeping sort of just the ships afloat. There is less money, there is less fiscal risks at the same time, because the center has been providing cheap loans to the regions, but at the same time they have mostly been asked to take over the political risks from the federal government.
So it sounds like the Kremlin, Putin and his team wants more control, but also don't want to be blamed for the consequences of said control.
In a nutshell, yes, thank you. Usually I should have asked you this question.
No.
Much more concise answer.
Well, brevity is the goal of this podcast, and man, this is a hard episode. All right, last topic from this paper: leaks and data. Tell me about that.
So, coming from this, of course, I mentioned that one of the main cornerstones of this governance policy, and basically the thing that makes it work, if it works, is data collection, and the fact that the center now knows as much information about a region as possible. This also means, of course, that they collect more information from the regional governments themselves, but also behind their back. So the way you should imagine it is that this is more or less Putin's call-in show, but on a much bigger scale and fully digitized, right? Like where they collected people's grievances, but only 1% of them was actually televised, but they knew about all the rest. Now, this is the same thing on a much bigger scale. And this was a shared endeavor of tactical alliance, so to say, of technocrats who had the know-how, like Premier Mishustin, and the security services who had the power to listen. And their interests were aligned because both of them wanted to know more about the situation on the ground. But this created various problems. Even before 2022, there were a bunch of leaks, mostly because of corruption and mostly as a consequence of this obsessive data collection. It also created, in some cases, a mistrust from citizens. So, for instance, COVID passports were opposed on the grounds that the data that the government collects might be used for something else. And you see this playing out on a much bigger scale now, the amalgamation of various databases that is planned and the digital draft notices that they're trying to introduce. So at the same time, this social media monitoring and monitoring of the vibes failed to predict, for instance, the uproar at mobilization. So the limits had been showing for a while now, but the war again has showed these limits much more clearly.
Andras, thank you for joining Report in Short. The Report in Short podcast is brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. That's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, stop by the website fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.